The house felt too quiet for a lesson. The door clicked in a way that didn't sound accidental. I stood there, realizing I wasn't supposed to leave. And in that moment, I understood how easily silence can be used as control. If stories like this make you think twice about the people around you, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon so you don't miss what happens next. I had always believed our neighborhood was safe, predictable, the kind of place where everyone smiled, waved, and pretended to look out for each other. That belief made what happened harder to recognize in the moment. It started with small corrections. The neighbor would comment on how I did things, how I spoke, how I walked across the yard, always framed as concern, always said with a calm voice that implied authority. They were older, respected, and known for keeping order. I didn't argue. I didn't complain. I thought ignoring it would make it stop. It didn't. One afternoon, they asked me to step inside their house to talk. They said it would only take a minute. I hesitated, but nothing about their tone sounded threatening. I stepped in. They closed the door behind me. At first, I didn't notice the lock. We talked about behavior, about respect, about learning consequences. Their words were measured, almost rehearsed. They told me I needed to understand boundaries. When I reached for the door to leave, it didn't open. I looked back at them confused. They said I needed to stay a little longer, that this was part of the lesson, that I needed time to think. My heart started pounding, but I stayed calm. I asked them to open the door. They didn't. They said I would leave when they decided I had learned enough. That was the moment fear turned into clarity. This wasn't concern. It wasn't guidance. It was control. I stood there listening to them talk as if nothing was wrong, as if what they were doing was normal. They spoke about how people needed to be taught early, how silence helped lessons sink in. I didn't shout. I didn't panic. I observed. I noticed how confident they were that I wouldn't tell anyone, how sure they were that I would stay quiet to avoid trouble. That assumption was their biggest mistake. After what felt like forever, they unlocked the door and told me to go home. They said if I behaved better, this wouldn't happen again. They smiled. I walked out without responding. At home, I sat in my room, replaying every word, every tone, every pause. I realized they had done this before, to others who never spoke up, people who didn't want to create conflict, people who thought staying silent was safer. I told myself I would speak, but not yet. I needed to understand how deep this went. Over the next few days, I paid attention. I noticed how neighbors deferred to this person, how no one questioned them, how discomfort was brushed off as misunderstanding. I also noticed how careful they became around me. They smiled more, spoke softer, acted like nothing had happened. That told me everything. They believed the lesson worked. They believed silence meant submission. What they didn't realize was that I wasn't staying quiet out of fear. I was choosing when to speak, and when I finally did, I wouldn't do it emotionally. I wouldn't accuse wildly. I would describe exactly what happened, calmly, clearly, without exaggeration, because the truth doesn't need volume. It needs witnesses. And as I began preparing myself to speak, I learned something unsettling. Others had experiences with this neighbor too, moments they had dismissed or buried. And the moment I hinted at what happened, their reactions told me this wasn't an isolated incident, it was a pattern. And patterns collapse the moment someone refuses to protect them with silence, setting in motion a chain of events that would change not just how that neighbor was seen, but how our entire community understood the difference between authority and abuse of trust. I didn't start by telling the whole story. I started by asking questions, quiet ones, careful ones, the kind that sound harmless but reveal more than accusations ever could. I asked a neighbor if they had ever felt uncomfortable being corrected by the same person. I asked another if they had ever been asked to stay inside for a talk. I watched their faces closely when I spoke. Most people laughed it off at first, nervous laughter, dismissive smiles, but their eyes told a different story. Some looked away too quickly, some hesitated before answering, some changed the subject entirely. That hesitation was important. One woman lowered her voice and said, "They mean well, they're just strict." I asked if strict meant locking doors. She didn't answer. Another neighbor told me they once cried after a conversation with the same person, but couldn't explain why. They said they felt embarrassed about it afterward, like it was their fault for being sensitive. That word came up a lot, sensitive. It's what people say when they don't want to examine behavior too closely. I realized then how the silence had survived for so long, not because everyone agreed with it, but because everyone assumed they were alone in their discomfort. That's how control spreads quietly, one person at a time. I decided to speak to an adult outside the neighborhood, someone who didn't share the same social ties, someone who wouldn't be pressured into keeping things quiet for the sake of peace. I chose a school counselor. I didn't dramatize anything. I didn't use emotional language. I described exactly what happened. The invitation inside, the door, the lock, the explanation given to me, the way it was framed as a lesson. The counselor listened without interrupting. When I finished, they asked one question. "Has this happened before? To you or anyone else?" I said I wasn't sure. They told me something that stayed with me. When someone feels comfortable crossing a line once, they've usually done it before. That confirmation made my chest tighten, not with fear, but with resolve. The counselor didn't rush. They asked permission before taking any steps. They explained options. They emphasized that what mattered most was safety and clarity, not punishment. That approach mattered. I agreed to let them speak to other students discreetly, not to accuse, but to ask if anyone had experienced similar behavior. The response came faster than anyone expected. Not dramatic disclosures, quiet confirmations, small details that matched mine too closely to ignore. Someone had been asked to stay inside for reflection. Someone else had been blocked from leaving during a lecture. Another had been told silence was part of learning respect. None of them had reported it, not because it wasn't wrong, but because it had been framed as normal. That's the most dangerous kind of betrayal, the kind that disguises itself as discipline. The counselor escalated the situation carefully. Authorities were informed, not with accusations, but with documented patterns, dates, behaviors, consistent language. I wasn't singled out anymore. I was part of a larger truth. The neighbor noticed the change immediately. They stopped speaking to me entirely. When they did speak to others, their tone shifted. Less confident, more defensive. They made comments about people being too sensitive these days. Those comments didn't land the way they used to. People were listening differently now. I felt nervous at times. I won't pretend I didn't. Speaking up changes how people see you. It removes the comfort of invisibility. But I also felt something stronger underneath the fear. Stability. I knew I hadn't exaggerated. I hadn't attacked. I had simply refused to carry something alone. That made all the difference. One afternoon, a community meeting was called. It wasn't announced as being about any one person. It was framed as a discussion about boundaries and safety, about appropriate roles and shared responsibility. The neighbor sat quietly through most of it. That silence was new. When someone mentioned the importance of consent, even in small interactions, the neighbor shifted in their seat. When another person spoke about how authority can be misunderstood, The room felt heavier. No one said their name. They didn't need to. After the meeting, several people approached me privately, not to ask for details, to say thank you, to say they hadn't known how to name what they felt until now. That's when I understood the full impact of speaking up. It wasn't just about what happened to me. It was about interrupting a pattern. The neighbor was eventually restricted from certain interactions, quietly, officially, without public shaming. They were told boundaries had been crossed, that behavior would be monitored, that the community expected better. They didn't argue. They couldn't, because the story no longer belonged to them. At home, I processed everything slowly. The adrenaline faded. The fear softened. What remained was a deep awareness of how easily power can hide behind calm words. I didn't feel victorious. I felt grounded. And as the days passed, the neighborhood adjusted. Conversations became more open. Parents asked more questions. Children were reminded they could leave uncomfortable situations. The person who had once believed silence was a tool learned that silence can turn on you the moment it's broken. I didn't confront them again. I didn't need to. The day I spoke up had already changed everything, and as the consequences settled into place, I realized the real revenge wasn't exposure or punishment. It was removing their ability to operate unchecked, replacing fear with awareness, and watching a community choose clarity over comfort, a choice that would echo long after this moment, reshaping how trust was earned rather than assumed. The neighborhood didn't transform overnight. It shifted the way a room shifts when someone opens a window, slow at first, then unmistakable. People began speaking in complete sentences instead of hints. They stopped excusing discomfort as just how things are, and the neighbor who had always relied on everyone's politeness started realizing politeness had limits. I noticed it in the smallest details. Parents stopped sending kids over there alone to help with chores. Adults stopped laughing off the neighbor's comments as harmless. People began walking a little more confidently past that house, like they no longer owed it its approval. The neighbor noticed too. They started showing up outside more often, making themselves visible, greeting people with extra warmth, offering favors. It felt like damage control, like they understood they were losing something and were trying to rebuild it with smiles. But smiles don't erase patterns. One afternoon, I saw them talking to another neighbor, speaking with that familiar calm authority. I watched the other neighbor nod at first, then pause, then shake their head slightly. The neighbor's expression tightened for a moment before the smile returned. I realized then that the real consequence wasn't any official restriction. It was social. The kind of consequence that follows you quietly, that changes how people respond to you even when no one is being dramatic. The neighbor had built their identity on being the reasonable one, the one who maintained order. Once that identity cracked, their power faded. Still, there was a part of me that felt uneasy, not because I regretted speaking up, but because I knew what often happens when someone loses control quietly. They look for a new way to regain it. I stayed alert, but I didn't obsess. I didn't want fear to become my personality. I kept going to school, I kept living my life, I kept my routines steady, but I also made one change I refused to compromise on. I stopped being alone near that house, not out of panic, out of principle. The counselor continued checking in with me occasionally, not in a way that made me feel monitored, but supported. They reminded me of something important. Speaking up once is powerful, but staying grounded afterward is how you keep your voice from being taken back. That helped. At the next community gathering, the neighbor arrived early and positioned themselves where they could be seen. They greeted people loudly, offered chairs, refilled cups. acted like the perfect host even though they weren't hosting. I could see the strategy. If they looked helpful enough, maybe the memory of what happened would feel less serious. Maybe people would doubt themselves again. But the difference now was that people weren't relying on memory alone. They had each other. Conversations flowed around the neighbor instead of through them. Their offers were accepted politely, but without gratitude. Their comments didn't guide the room anymore. They tried to speak to me once that evening, approaching with a calm expression and soft voice, like they were doing me a favor by being gentle. "I'm glad you're doing well," they said. I looked at them and replied, evenly, "I'm glad the neighborhood is learning what boundaries mean." Their smile faltered, just briefly. Then they nodded as if agreeing and walked away. That interaction spread through the gathering without me saying another word. Not as gossip, but as confirmation. People noticed that I wasn't afraid, and that made them less afraid too. After that, the neighbors stopped trying to engage with me directly. Instead, they tried something else, shaping the narrative. I heard it through indirect comments, people mentioning that the neighbor felt misunderstood, that they were old-fashioned, that they didn't mean harm. The words were familiar, like a script being repeated. But something had changed in how those words landed. People responded with calm questions instead of agreement. What does misunderstood mean? Why was a lock involved? Why couldn't someone leave when they wanted to? Those questions were simple. They didn't accuse, they didn't insult. They just refused to accept vague explanations. The neighbor's story couldn't survive that kind of scrutiny. One evening, my parents sat me down and told me they had been approached. The neighbor had spoken to them, trying to frame what happened as a misunderstanding. They implied I had been disrespectful and needed correction. They suggested my parents should reinforce discipline. My parents looked embarrassed saying it, like they hated repeating it aloud. I listened quietly and asked, "What did they say?" My father said, "We told them never to involve you in their lessons again." My mother added, "We told them they don't get to decide what you deserve." I felt something loosen in my chest. It wasn't triumph, it was safety. Not because everyone was suddenly perfect, but because my parents had chosen clarity over comfort. They hadn't tried to keep peace by sacrificing my boundaries. That choice mattered more than any community meeting. A few days later, a formal check-in happened. Again, not dramatic, not loud, just procedural. Adults in authority spoke with the neighbor about appropriate conduct, about supervision, about respectful boundaries, about how lessons are not a private neighbor's role. The neighbor responded politely, but their eyes looked colder afterward. I didn't let that scare me. I didn't interpret it as danger. I interpreted it as a person realizing they couldn't operate the way they used to. That's often when the final shift happens, because someone who relied on silence can't adjust to transparency without losing something. The neighbor became quieter after that, less visible, less involved. Their house looked the same, but their presence in the neighborhood felt smaller. People stopped orbiting them, and in that new space, something else happened. Kids started talking more openly about what they felt uncomfortable with. Parents listened. Small conflicts were addressed earlier. The whole neighborhood became a little more awake. I hadn't expected that. I thought speaking up would only change my situation. Instead, it changed the culture. That was the real revenge, not harming anyone, not humiliating anyone, but taking away the environment that allowed quiet control to thrive, replacing it with shared awareness, an awareness that kept spreading, turning private discomfort into public standards, and preparing the ground for one final moment that would confirm the neighbor's power was gone for good. The confirmation didn't arrive with an announcement. It came the way most permanent changes do, through absence. The neighbors stopped appearing at gatherings. Their lights stayed off in the evenings. The porch that once felt like a watchtower became just another part of the street. No one celebrated it. No one needed to. The space they left behind felt lighter, like the neighborhood had exhaled without realizing it had been holding its breath. People spoke more freely. Kids played without being corrected mid-laugh. Parents lingered in conversations instead of scanning the street. What surprised me most was how quickly the community adjusted once fear was removed. It was as if everyone had been waiting for permission to relax. I ran into the neighbor one last time on a quiet afternoon. We crossed paths near the mailbox. There was no tension in the air, just distance. They nodded, polite and restrained, the way people do when they know a conversation would only make things worse. I nodded back. That was all. No words, no confrontation, no final exchange that would turn the story into something dramatic. That silence felt different from the one they had used before. This one wasn't controlling. It was powerless. At home, life settled into a new rhythm. My parents didn't hover, but they checked in. Not out of fear, out of care. They asked how I felt, not what I planned to do. They listened more than they spoke. That shift changed how I saw them. I realized they had been learning too. The counselor eventually told me the matter was considered resolved. Boundaries had been clarified, expectations set, monitoring put in place, all done quietly, professionally, without spectacle. That approach mattered, because justice doesn't always need to be loud to be effective. Sometimes it works best when it's calm enough to last. I thought about the moment in that house, the click of the lock, the tone used to explain it away, the confidence that I wouldn't say anything. That confidence had been built on years of people choosing comfort over truth. It had been wrong, and it had been fragile. I didn't feel angry anymore. I didn't feel the need to revisit it. What stayed with me instead was awareness. How easily authority can slip into control when no one questions it, and how quickly it collapses when someone does. I started trusting my instincts more. That quiet voice that had warned me something was wrong had been right, not just then, but in other moments too. Moments where silence felt expected, where discomfort was dismissed as overreaction. I stopped dismissing it. I learned that speaking up doesn't always change people, but it always changes you. It reclaims something internal. It redraws the line between fear and self-respect. The neighborhood never talked openly about what happened. It didn't need to. The standard had shifted. Boundaries were clearer. Expectations were shared. Silence no longer protected bad behavior. It exposed it. That was enough. Years from now, someone might walk past that house and never know what it once represented. They'll see a building, a lawn, a door. Nothing more. But I'll remember. Not with fear. With clarity. Because the day I spoke up wasn't just the day everything changed. It was the day I learned that power only exists where silence allows it, and that once silence is broken with calm truth, power has nowhere left to hide. That lesson stays with you, long after the door opens.